It was 5 a.m. on June 21st, 1621, and there would be a man atop of a scaffold in Old Town Square in Prague. His name, Mydlář. He would have 4 swords like this, sharpened to a razor's edge, to cut off 15 heads that morning and hang about 12 others, the 27 noblemen of Prague that were responsible for trying to overthrow the government of the Habsburgs. He would become one of the more celebrated executioners of the day. Did you know Mydlář? Next on DYK. So welcome to DYK. This episode, just as a fair warning to you, is maybe not for the kids. It's going to be a little grotesque because we're talking about, a very tough situation about execution, and it wasn't very pretty at the time in 1621.
This is a goddamn solemn occasion, so shut the hell up, all right?
This is the worst field trip ever.
Mydlář was a man that was hard to hold to one's chest. He could be considered maybe an anti-hero to some, and maybe a person of pity that we would have today too for what would befall upon him later in life. Make no doubt about it, this was a seminal moment for Prague and for Europe. This was on the dawn of the 30 Years' War, which is one of the worst wars that Europe had to face up until most likely World War I. One of the last wars that would ever use mercenaries, and it was a very destructive and brutal conflict across Europe for 30 years. And the seeds were sown here in Prague. And the front row seat, Mydlář was there on top of that scaffolding in 1621. But why was he there? Why was he executing 27 Czech noblemen, of all things, that would send ripples across Europe? Well, here on DYK, we're going to jump into that because you need to know a little bit of the backstory of the Battle of Bílá Hora, or as we say in English, the Battle of White Mountain. In historical terms, the 1620 battle happened in early November and marked the beginning of the end of Bohemia's self-rule for the next 300 years. To understand the unrest, we have to go back 2 years earlier to the year 1618. Prague was in upheaval. The Second Prague Defenestration, whereas the Protestants threw out several Catholic representatives of Emperor Ferdinand II out of the Prague castle window, set the wheels in motion to rein in the anti-Catholic movement in Bohemia. It was then that the Winter King, King of Bohemia Frederick V, was named ruler over the Czech lands. Habsburg forces had to be used to rid the lands of this Protestant influence. Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II sent his troops to lay down the law to the Bohemian noblemen and to the recently crowned Bohemian King Frederick. These events culminated in the Battle of White Mountain just outside the city gates of Prague on a cold and rainy day on November 8, 1620. The Protestant army, totaling around 13,000, faced a much more skilled and numerous Catholic League force of 27,000 strong. The plains of Bílá Hora would be stained red with the blood of the estimated 5,000 casualties. The actual Battle of Bílá Hora lasted only 1 hour and left the Bohemian army in ruins. It all fell apart so quickly. By the time the Bohemian King Frederick started his way to the battlefield, the Battle of White Mountain had already been decided. With the Bohemian army already destroyed, the Catholic forces entered Prague and the revolt collapsed. King Frederick fled the country with his English wife Elizabeth, thus being named the Winter King for his short winter rule. Just under 50 noblemen were rounded up, imprisoned, and tortured. A year later, in 1621, 27 of these traitor noblemen were executed on the Old Town Square in Prague, hanged, mutilated, or decapitated as a warning to all enemies of the imperial crown of Emperor Ferdinand II. So now you have the context on why Mydlář was so important on that June 21st day in 1621. But let's go back and talk about the man himself. How did he get to this position of being an executioner? One of the worst positions you could actually hold in Europe at this time. Why is that? Well, because an executioner had a rough life. He was in society, but out of society at the same time. He could only circle himself by people that were other fellow executioners. And what was very interesting about this was that Even though he was considered a well-to-do man in this community, he was part of a profession that was on the bottom rung of everything you can think of. So Jan Mydlář was a man that was caught between one world and another. But how did he get in this mess in the first place? Well, it had to do with a broken heart to a first cousin.
Okay, on the count of three, say what level of cousins we would have to be for this to be okay. 1, 2, 3.
Fifth.
Unacceptable no matter what.
As gross as that might sound, but we don't know exactly for a fact if this story is true, but we have some facts that were historically backed up, and we have some things that were kind of embellished. And here in Czech Republic, where I'm living here in Prague now, we have a lot of that with embellishment with legends. And of course, this really applies to Jan Mydlář's story. There was a writer from the late 19th century by the name of Josef Svatek, and he was a guy that put things together from the legends and the facts together. He did a great deal of research to put up the book Prague's Executioner, Memoirs of Prague's Executioner to be exact. And Svatek's book kind of talks about Mydlář coming into this profession because he wanted to do an escape attempt for a woman that he loved, his first cousin by the name of Dorota. Well, Jan Mydlář, being a student of medicine at the time at the Prague universities, decided that he was going to pretend to be an executioner, if you can believe that. And what he did was try to go in and try to rescue her. So here's the story. Jan Mydlář starts to make this great plan to free Dorota and run away together. Well, it doesn't work out. He gets caught. She gets walled up alive into a dungeon, as rough as that is. Can you say Game of Thrones, right? And what happens to him? He gets inducted from not being a medical practitioner anymore, but to become a forced executioner. And what did that mean? That meant some rough stuff. That meant the fact that he will no longer ever from that point on be anything else but an executioner. So that takes us to that point on June 21st, the summer solstice in 1621. Between the hours of 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., the walls were closed to Prague. Thousands of people were gathered in Old Town Square. And on this giant scaffolding, about 6 feet tall off the ground, would be men after men coming up on the stage to be put to death, even tortured while they were on the stage before they were completely killed by Jan Mydlář. In that crowd, you had representatives from many other royal houses across Europe. This was a big deal. No one killed noblemen before, man. But this happened. And because this happened, it sent shockwaves across these nobility houses that even their necks could be cut at any given time.
Have you any last words?
None.
Test! Hold!
Jan Mydlář would have a sword like this. Well, not quite like a sword like this. It actually would be a blunt end at the very end, not a point. But what he would have here would be a very sharpened, razor-sharp sword. He had 4 of them done. And he did this on purpose because he wanted to make sure that he had the strength and the right equipment to go through very quickly with those 15 noblemen's heads that he would have to cut off. It was said in the crowd that he was so good at what he did and so strong, but he would take the handle, these 2 handles like this, 2-hand handle, and he would come down straight like this with full force. So hard, they said that the head would fly off several feet into the crowd. I told you this show wasn't for kids, right? So there would be very little pain suffered by the person that was being beheaded. And that was because he cared about these men. He cared about them so much that he was able to make sure there was no mistake. One point I need to make about this is that if you were going to get your head cut off, and we've seen this many times through royal decapitations, so to speak, that you would pay a little bit extra. You have a little gold pence, or a groschen, so to speak, and you would give it to the executioner saying, can you do your job right? Because the last thing you want to do is 3 or 4 hacks down on your head if it didn't work. So to say it was gruesome would have been an understatement. Each one of these men had a different sort of execution plan in place. It wasn't just a quick sort of lobbing off of the head. Some men were actually had their hands cut off first, and then they had their head decapitated. That was to kind of prove more to the point that they were the ringleaders of this Battle of White Mountain, funders basically of what was going on. So he had to do all those things. He had to nail one man's tongue to a board because he protested too much, and the emperor wanted to make an example of him. There was one man that Jan Mydlář really didn't look forward to killing, and that was Jan Jasinski. Jan Jasinski was one of his mentors that he had at the university. They actually kind of worked together. Jan Jasinski was an intelligent man, one of the most intelligent men of that era, and he was to be executed that day. He was in a situation where Jan Mydlář knew him, and Jan Mydlář was actually one of those guys that would kind of steal dead bodies for him so he could dissect to make anatomical drawings for at the medical college. So they had a background, and Jan Mydlář knew that this was going to be a tough way to go, so he was going to do the best he could, but he had a mandate to make Jan Jasinski's death prolonged.
Johannes Jesenius, de Magna Jesen.
So what Jan Mydlář did, he would cut off the hands first, and then quickly cut off the head of one of his good friends, Jasinski. And that's one of the tough things that the crowd really did not like to see, because Jasinski was a beloved guy in Prague. So if you can imagine that, this day was a long day. 15 heads chopped off, some torturers on the side, and about 12 men that were hanged on scaffoldings across the Old Town Square of Prague. A rough day, to say the least. So what happened to Jan Mydlář after all this? Well, he was responsible for taking the heads and putting them in little cages, as nice as that would be, and putting them on Charles Bridge, Karlovy Most, here in Prague. And they would stay for 10 to 20 years. They would rot away, and of course there'd just be the skull, sun-bleached skull that was standing there. But it would be a reminder to anybody that came into Prague that this is what you don't do to try to overthrow the government. Ferdinand II's sort of pounding into this idea would really alienate him from his subjects here in Prague and in Czechia. Jan Mydlář was on the receiving end of some of that hate. He couldn't be really walking through the streets and given any kind of acknowledgement. His wife, Beata, really couldn't take the ostracization anymore. They were ostracized, and because of that, she committed suicide. He couldn't really get a fair shake anywhere he went. He was known to be one of them, right, of the Habsburgs, because he was the tool that did all this. He had a lot of money from this execution, but he really couldn't spend it anywhere because no one would take it. So, a really tough life in the sense for Jan Mydlář in what he had to go through. Looking forward into his progeny, well, not so great either. His grandson, of all crazy things, was an executioner as well. Remember we talked about once an executioner, always an executioner, your kid's an executioner? Well, his grandson was an executioner, but was charged with arson in Prague that caught most of the city on fire. And because of that, he was sentenced to death on that same scaffolding that his grandfather used in 1621, and he had his head chopped off. So not a great sort of ending for a lot of these guys here connected to Jan Mydlář, but a man that I think is important for you to know. Here in Prague, everybody knows him, but the rest of the world here should know him now too as well. So now you know about the executioner, Jan Mydlář. We want to thank you for joining us tonight on DYK, Past Access DYK. So if you have any questions or comments, or you want to help maybe donate to the show, or give us some ideas that you want us to go after for the next episode, don't hesitate to send us an email. Go to pastaccess.com. You'll see the DYK spinning logo there. Click that. You'll see all of our shows, the ones especially coming up, and you can also send us an email message there. If you want to help support the show, which we would love your help, there's a lot of overhead we have to do with this program, you can actually go to podcastnicshop.com, and you can take a look at some of the great merch that we've got there. Some things that are on DYK, some things for Past Access, and some of our other podcasts that we have under the Podcastnic label. And remember, you can also be part of this show. Give us an idea about what you want us to cover on DYK. It could be anything from culture to history to disasters. Well, you name it. We'll put it to our spinning wheel of destiny on the last part of the month to give you a chance to maybe dictate what I need to do. And we'll follow up on that show. So until next time, for Past Access DYK from Prague, I'm Pete Coleman. Have a good night.
This has been Past Access Did You Know with Pete Coleman. For more information on this topic or other DYK shows, please visit us at pastaccess.com. Be sure to visit our Past Access YouTube channel, like and subscribe.